Okay, let's unpack this. You probably heard a lot lately about the science of reading movement, right? It's often presented as this really vital, evidence-based response to concerns about reading scores.
Yeah, something that sounds, urgent and fundamentally good for kids on the surface.
Exactly.
And that's the exact perception that our source material for this deep dive really challenges.
Okay.
We're looking at a piece by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks titled Literacy as Smokescreen: How the Trump Administration's Science of Reading Weaponizes Education.
Literacy as Smokescreen. Interesting title.
It is.
Yeah.
And the core argument Dr. Hoerricks makes here is that this policy shift isn't actually about literacy or science, but rather, like the title says, a smokescreen.
Hiding something else.
Yeah, hiding what the author argues is a deeper, more troubling agenda.
So our mission today, then, is to really dive into this specific source, Dr. Hoerricks' piece,
Right,
and explore their claim that the science of reading push is fundamentally a political project, not just a pedagogical one.
We want to understand what, according to this author, is truly at its core.
And the author brings a particularly interesting perspective, you mentioned, from the source.
They do. Dr. Hoerricks has academic credentials, classroom experience, and, importantly, has reviewed what's presented as evidence for commercial literacy programs.
Oh, how so?
In their role as an institutional review board chairperson, an IRB chair.
Okay. So they've seen the research side.
Exactly. But despite this diverse background, the author shares that they feel actively excluded from the dominant narrative around the science of reading being promoted.
So that personal experience frames their critique.
It seems to, yes. It gives a specific edge to the points they make in the piece.
So why explore this particular viewpoint? Well, because you, the learner, want to see different angles, right? You want to get past the surface headlines.
Understand the complexities.
Yeah. And this source offers a powerful, maybe challenging perspective that really pushes us to ask different kinds of questions about what's driving educational policy right now. So let's jump into that central argument from the source. Dr. Hoerricks puts it pretty strongly.
They do.
This push for the science of reading isn't, in their view, a genuine attempt to improve student outcomes.
Right. Instead, they argue it's a political strategy, carefully dressed up in scientific language.
The source uses that phrase, a technocratic veneer.
That's it. A technocratic veneer laid over a far more troubling project.
Okay, so what is that troubling project according to the source? What are the real goals behind the smokescreen?
Well, Dr. Hoerricks identifies three key ones in the piece. First, institutional defunding of public education.
Defunding.
Second, a drive for centralized ideological control over what's taught. And third, what the author calls privatization by stealth.
Privatization by stealth.
Yeah.
How does the source suggest this narrowing of instruction helps enable those goals? I mean, how does that work?
Well, the author argues it's done by strategically narrowing what gets to count as legitimate literacy instruction at the policy level.
So defining it very tightly.
Exactly. By defining science-based reading very, very narrowly, the source argues you can then direct funding, control curriculum content, and open doors for specific commercial vendors.
And according to the piece, that narrow definition has a very specific impact, right? The author claims it conveniently excludes particular groups and approaches.
Precisely. Dr. Hoerricks writes that this rigid focus ends up leaving out multilingual learners, students who are neurodivergent, practitioners who use trauma-informed approaches, and basically anyone whose methods don't strictly fit into what they describe as a rigid, phonics-first, data-driven script.
And that ties back to the author's personal experience you mentioned.
It does. The author shares their own claim of feeling excluded from this movement despite their background in the field, which includes, that IRB experience.
Right.
Now, this policy push isn't just theoretical in the source. Dr. Hoerricks connects it directly to specific actions taken by the Trump administration.
Okay, like what?
The author points specifically to the May 2025 Department of Education grant priorities. These explicitly pushed for a back-to-basics approach in literacy.
And this wasn't happening in isolation, I gather.
Not according to the source, no. The author notes this happened alongside the termination of federal research tools like the What Works Clearinghouse.
Oh, wow.
Staff reductions at the Institute for Education Sciences, IES, and an openly critical stance toward diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, DEI.
So?
Dr. Hoerricks describes this pattern as unmistakable, arguing it's not really about strengthening public instruction, but rather about narrowing its scope and increasing control.
And this leads us to the source's really critical look at the very claim of being evidence-based.
Yes.
This is where the author's experience as an IRB chairperson seems particularly relevant then.
It really is. The author uses that specific experience to critique the evidence base often cited for these mandated commercial programs.
Also, what kind of critique?
Well, Dr. Hoerricks claims they've reviewed studies for these programs where they saw significant concerns. Things like inadequate oversight, lack of fully informed consent from parents, and also random assignment designs that, in the author's view, actually risked educational harm.
Harm? How?
For example, control groups being knowingly denied instruction that was believed to be effective just to create a comparison.
So, the author is suggesting that because the vendors conducting this research might operate outside robust independent oversight, and their results happen to align with a desired policy narrative, these programs gain scientific legitimacy.
That's the core of the author's argument in this part of the piece, yes.
Even with potential ethical concerns lingering.
Right. They are claiming that evidence base in this specific context becomes almost a euphemism.
For what?
For politically sanctioned.
Wow.
Dr. Hoerricks writes that phonics, viewed this way, becomes the only real measure of legitimacy.
And the result?
Reducing instruction largely to decoding drills, maybe without enough meaningful engagement, and thereby becoming, in the author's view, a tool of control rather than liberation.
Let's unpack that phrase, back to basics, a little more, because the source argues it functions as something more than just, a nostalgic idea.
Right. Dr. Hoerricks calls it a dog whistle.
A dog whistle, meaning?
Meaning it might sound innocent on the surface, maybe suggesting a return to simpler proven methods.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
But the author argues it actually signals a return to a very rigid exclusionary model, one based on what they describe as white, able-bodied, monolingual norms.
So not just simpler, but narrower.
Narrower, and the author argues exclusionary. The piece describes it as a rhetorical cudgel used to enforce a particular vision of education.
And the source even draws a historical line here, mentioning the Reading First initiative from years ago.
Yes, exactly. The author points to Reading First as a kind of parallel.
In what way?
Noting that while Reading First did boost decoding scores in some studies, it generally didn't improve overall reading comprehension or student engagement, and importantly, it ushered in a period of increased top-down curriculum control. Which
Dr. Hoerricks sees echoed in the current push.
That's the connection the author makes, yes.
Okay, so the source argues that under the Trump administration, this back-to-basics idea is explicitly used as a weaponized value system. What does the author mean by that? Weaponized.
Dr. Hoerricks claims it's deliberately designed to strip what the administration termed divisive ideologies from classrooms.
Divisive ideologies? Like what, according to the source?
The author lists specific areas that are treated as suspect or dangerous within this framework. Discussions of systemic racism, acknowledging multilingual realities in the classroom, neurodivergence, queer or trans embodiment, and also trauma-informed practice.
So just talking about these things is seen as ideological.
The source's view is that simply including these aspects of students' realities and the world becomes politicized under this back-to-basics agenda, it's framed as dangerous.
So the source is making the case that this push signals a desire for ideological purity within education.
That's the argument.
Rather than a genuine concern for improving literacy for all students, regardless of background.
Exactly. Dr. Hoerricks argues that any curricula that challenge these perceived norms, the white monolingual neurotypical standard, are viewed as dangerous.
Why dangerous?
Because, according to the source, they threaten what the author calls the ideological project of control.
And within that framework,
diversity, linguistic, cultural, neurological, is positioned not as a strength or a reality to be embraced, but as a liability, something to be managed or eliminated.
Okay, so underpinning this entire push, according to the source, is something Dr. Hoerricks calls the myth of the universal reader.
Yes, this is a really central concept in the piece.
The myth of the universal reader. What does the author mean by that? What is this mythical reader like?
Well, Dr. Hoerricks describes this imagined reader quite specifically. It's someone who decodes fluently and early, progresses through reading stages predictably.
Like clockwork.
Sort of, yeah. They respond well to scripted, sequential instruction. They're easily assessed via standardized tests. And importantly, this reader is presumed to be neurotypical, monolingual, probably middle class, and compliant.
Compliant.
Yes, and the author is very clear in the source. This reader is a fiction, a construct.
But treated as real.
Treated as the benchmark, the default, against which all real, diverse students are measured, and often found wanting.
And the author shares a really powerful personal story in the piece that brings this point home, doesn't it?
They do. It's quite striking. Dr. Hoerricks shares their own experience of graduating high school functionally illiterate.
Functionally illiterate.
Despite being intelligent.
Exactly. Despite being highly intelligent, they identify as a gestalt language processor. Meaning they process language more in chunks, patterns, melodies, rather than linearly, piece by piece, analytically.
Okay.
And they were in a system built entirely for those analytical processors.
Right. The standard model. So the author uses this personal story to illustrate how, in their view, this narrow science of reading model focus solely on sequential decoding and linear skills.
It actively erases learners like that.
That's the phrase they use. It erases learners who don't fit that mythical universal profile.
So the source argues that this model, because it assumes language acquisition is this linear universal process, it ends up pathologizing natural variation in how kids actually learn.
That's right. It takes difference and frames it as deficit. Dr. Hoerricks gives examples from the source.
Like what?
Like a student's rich cultural context or home language is treated as noise to be ignored rather than a resource.
Okay.
Narrative reasoning, how some kids make sense of stories through association or connection, is seen as a problem if it doesn't fit the expected analytical sequence.
Right.
Gestalt processing, like the author's own experience, gets simply labeled a specific learning disability. So the author argues that learners from diverse backgrounds or with different neurological processing styles are often just flagged as at risk, delayed, or disordered.
And the intervention.
Often they're given these isolating, often meaningless, decodable readers focusing only on the mechanics.
Completely missing the meaning part.
Completely missing, in the author's view, that real meaning, real literacy, comes from genuine connection and engagement, not just compliance with the prescribed script.
And Dr. Hoerricks uses a really strong term, institutional gaslighting, to describe what happens here.
They do.
What do they mean by that in this context?
They use it to describe the experience of a child whose natural way of making meaning from language is systematically disregarded or labeled as wrong by the very institution, the school that's supposed to be educating them.
That sounds incredibly damaging.
It does. The source also discusses what the author calls linguistic containment.
Linguistic containment, another striking phrase.
Yes. Dr. Hoerricks argues that by reducing reading primarily to decoding skills, especially focusing on a white standard English paradigm, literacy instruction itself becomes a kind of gatekeeper.
A gatekeeper to what?
To further educational advancement, to opportunity. If you don't master this narrow skill in the prescribed way, you're locked out.
So the author's conclusion here is pretty sharp then.
It is. They basically say the real disorder isn't in the diverse learners who don't fit the mold.
But where?
The disorder, they argue, is in the system itself. A system built around this single imagined profile, labeling it as science, and fundamentally failing to distinguish difference from deficit.
Okay, so pulling all of these points together from the source, Dr. Hoerricks' overall view is quite stark.
It is.
They argue we're witnessing the weaponization of literacy.
Right. That's a key term they use. Not literacy as liberation, but literacy weaponized.
Used as what?
It's a mechanism of containment, a sorting tool, a performance of compliance.
Compliance.
Yes. Less about genuine understanding or expression, more about demonstrating adherence to the system's narrow expectations.
And the source highlights how, under those grant priorities they mentioned earlier from May 2025, funding is now argued to flow primarily to those programs or districts that perform that compliance most faithfully.
Exactly. Dr. Hoerricks calls this a wholesale rewriting of legitimacy in the field of education. What counts as good or effective is being redefined around this compliance.
And the author reiterates that practices labeled scientific are, in their view, narrowly defined specifically to exclude diverse learners.
Yes, and that this is done under what they call a false cloak of neutrality.
Which the source explicitly describes as a lie.
That's the word used in the piece, yes, a lie.
The source gives specific examples of marginalized students who, in the author's words, are not built into the model, right?
Correct. Students whose ways of learning and being don't align with that universal reader myth.
And points out how the evidence used to justify these programs is selectively applied.
Mm-hmm. And how the metrics used often end up rewarding compliance with the model, like scores on phonics drills rather than actual comprehension, critical thinking, or genuine literacy development.
And Dr. Hoerricks points out what they see as a significant irony here.
Yes, the irony that practices trying to honor students' actual lives, their home language, cultural discourse, experiences of trauma, social-emotional learning needs,
Yeah.
these are often dismissed by proponents of this narrow SOR approach as being ideological, distractions from the real work of decoding.
While the mandated, standardized approach is presented
as supposedly non-ideological, neutral,
Yeah.
purely scientific.
Of course, the author clearly refutes.
Absolutely. The author frames this inconsistency as central to what they call the containment strategy, defining what's acceptable very narrowly and labeling everything else as problematic ideology.
And the source argues this strategy functions on multiple levels, not just policy.
Right. Psychologically, children learn they have to perform according to the script just to survive or succeed in the system. Institutionally, teachers feel pressured or are even required to disregard the relational, meaning-making aspects of learning in favor of scripted instruction and data points.
And politically.
Politically, difference is consistently framed as deficiency, and those who resist this narrow definition, teachers, researchers, parents, are often disciplined or marginalized, labeled as unscientific or, again, ideological.
So the author concludes this section by arguing that literacy, in this specific push, becomes less about personal expression or flourishing,
Yeah.
and much more about assimilation and conformity to a narrow standard.
That's the argument being made. Literacy as a tool for sorting and conforming.
So, given this really sharp critique, what does the source suggest as a way forward? Where do we go from here, according to Dr. Hoerricks?
Well, the author calls for, fundamentally, a reclaiming and redefining of literacy itself.
Taking the term back.
Essentially, yes. And
Yeah.
being clear about what, in their view, real literacy is.
Which
is comprehension, expression, connection, meaning-making. Dr. Hoerricks writes that it's a deeply human act that, by its very nature, cannot be truly standardized or reduced to a simple checklist.
And importantly, what it is not.
Exactly. It's not just phonics in isolation. It's not just decoding as the sole endpoint. And it's certainly not just performing compliance for the system.
And the author emphasizes a key point here. The path forward isn't, in their view, back to basics.
No, definitely not. Dr. Hoerricks explicitly calls back to basics a trap.
A trap.
Yes, and a nostalgic fantasy that ignores the diverse reality of learners today.
So if not back, then where?
According to the source, the only viable and just way forward is through inclusion.
Inclusion, meaning what? Specifically, according to the piece, how does that translate into practice?
Dr. Hoerricks envisions classrooms where neurological diversity, cultural diversity, linguistic diversity isn't just tolerated, but is the foundational design principle. It's the starting point, not an afterthought or a problem to be managed.
So building the system around the students, not the other way around.
Precisely. Where curriculum offers both mirrors for students to see themselves and their experiences reflected, and windows into other worlds, other perspectives. And where pedagogy, the way we teach, sees difference not as a problem to be fixed, but as fertile ground for learning and growth for everyone.
Does the source list specific practices they advocate for?
It does. Things like trauma-informed literacy approaches that recognize students' lived experiences, practices that actively celebrate and incorporate home languages, methods that affirm and work with Gestalt language processors, not against them.
So understanding different ways of learning language.
Yes. And Dr. Hoerricks calls for instruction that understands that meaning isn't just in the black and white words on the page.
Where else?
In tone, in gesture, in pacing, in metaphor, in context, in all the rich ways humans communicate. Approaches that fundamentally trust children and the knowledge and experiences they already bring to the classroom.
Instead of seeing them as empty vessels to be filled with phonics rules.
Exactly. Ultimately, the author calls for a focus on the actual science, not just of reading, but of learning. The broader science of human learning in all its diversity.
And Dr. Hoerricks ends with a very strong final statement, specifically about the Trump administration's agenda related to this science of reading push, right?
And they do. It circles back to the initial claim.
What's the final takeaway?
Arguing forcefully that this agenda, as presented in policy, is not truly aimed at helping all students learn to read comprehensively, but is, in the author's view, a deliberate effort to reshape public education, to make it narrower, harsher, and inherently exclusionary.
And reducing literacy itself.
Reducing literacy, ultimately, to a easily measured metric of compliance and using it as a tool for gatekeeping opportunity.
Okay, so to quickly recap the source's core argument we've explored today, Dr. Hoerricks claims that the push for the science of reading, particularly at the federal policy level under the Trump administration, isn't primarily about improving literacy outcomes for all kids.
Right. That's the central thesis.
Instead, according to the author, it's argued to be more about political control, potentially defunding public education, and sorting students ideologically.
Yes, relying on a very narrow definition of reading and promoting what the author calls the myth of the universal reader.
A standard that, in their view, actively excludes many, many learners.
Correct. That's the essence of the critique presented in the source.
And exploring this particular perspective from Dr. Hoerricks' piece gives you, the listener, a different lens, doesn't it?
Hopefully, yes. A lens to critically evaluate policy claims, especially when they're presented as simple, settled science.
And to maybe look for those potential layers beneath educational initiatives that might seem straightforward on the surface.
Exactly. To ask more questions.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, drawing from the source's argument about inclusion and diverse learners. Given this deep dive into Dr. Hoerricks' view, how might you now look differently at the incredibly varied ways people learn and make meaning? And perhaps, what questions might you ask about educational systems or approaches that seem to only validate one specific way of reading or learning?
It definitely gives you something to think about. Thank you for engaging with this material with us today.